sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Zuseherinnen und Zuseher, ich darf Sie ganz herzlich zu der heutigen virtuellen Veranstaltung des Hamburger Instituts für Sozialforschung begrüßen. Eine Veranstaltung, die einen besonderen Charakter trägt. Sie ist gewissermaßen Teil eines größeren Komplexes, nämlich die zweite Vorlesung im Rahmen der Verleihung des Siegfried Landshut Preises 2020 an die US-amerikanische Historikerin Isabel V. Einige, wenn nicht gar die meisten von Ihnen, werden die Veranstaltung vom Dienstag, dem 18. Mai, bereits gehört und gesehen haben und dabei auch die Laudatio von Rebecca Habermas auf die Preisträgerin. Insofern fällt es mir schwer, noch irgendetwas hinzuzufügen, weil ich mich angesichts der ebenso erhellenden wie liebenswürdigen Ausführungen von Frau Habermas nur blamieren könnte. Ich verstehe es deshalb, ich versuche es erst deshalb gar nicht, sondern will nur ganz wenige Worte zu Isabel V verlieren, sodass auch die neu hinzugekommenen Zuseherinnen nicht ganz unvorbereitet sein werden. Isabel V ist weltweit eine der bedeutendsten und interessantesten Deutschlandhistorikerinnen und dementsprechend ausgezeichnet und hoch dekoriert. Die lange Zeit an der Cornell University lehrende Isabel V hat durch Monographien zur Entourage Kaiser Wilhelms II., zur Regulierung von Sexualität in den deutschen Ländern zwischen 1750 und 1850, zur Kriegsführung des Deutschen Kaiserreichs vom kolonialen Vernichtungskrieg gegen die Herero und Nama bis hin zum Ersten Weltkrieg und zum im letzten Drittel des 19. und im ersten Drittel des 20. Jahrhunderts zu beobachtenden Umgang Deutschlands und westlichen Nationen mit dem Völker- und Kriegsrecht schnell internationale Aufmerksamkeit erregt. Dies deshalb, weil sie nicht nur immer thesenstarke Bücher vorgelegt hat, sondern auch solche, die genauestens aus den Quellen gearbeitet waren, die sich häufig gegen den Mainstream der damaligen Geschichtswissenschaft wendeten und die sich zudem oft an höchst schwierigen Gegenständen abarbeiteten, nicht zuletzt eben auch am Recht und Völkerrecht. Ihr Œuvre ist deshalb auch gar nicht so einfach einzuordnen. Umfasst es doch Bereiche der Geschlechter- und Kulturgeschichte ebenso wie dasjenige der Militär- und Rechtsgeschichte. Wobei immer auch die Bereitschaft erkennbar war, Ansätze aus der Soziologie oder der Anthropologie heranzuziehen, mit denen sie ihre Argumente schärfen konnte. Mit ihrer brillanten Rede zur Verleihung des Siegfried Landshut Preises am vergangenen Dienstag hat sie dann auch noch einmal unbewusst und ungewollt bestätigt, warum sie die Wissenschaftlerinnen des HIS als Preisträgerin vorgeschlagen haben. Hall beschäftigte sich mit, so der Titel ihrer Rede, dem Customary International Law for Historians. Und sie tat dies auf eine Weise, durch die man ihr gewissermaßen beim Arbeiten, beim historischen Forschen zusehen konnte. Denn dieses Customary International Law ist, obwohl höchst wirkmächtig, tatsächlich schwer zu greifen. Eben weil es als Gewohnheitsrecht ja nirgendwo nachzulesen, also nicht fixiert ist. Wie hat man es also zu fassen? Kann man es überhaupt fassen? Und es war eine Freude für das Publikum, Isabel V dabei zuzusehen, wie sie sich mit der existierenden schwierigen juristischen Fachliteratur auseinandersetzte, wie sie jederzeit nachvollziehbar begriffliche Unterscheidungen traf, wie sie sich geduldig, aber eben auch zielstrebig ihrem Gegenstand näherte, der für die Zuhörerinnen dann immer deutlicher wurde, sodass man zum Ende den Eindruck hatte, ohnehin immer schon gewusst zu haben, was dieses Customary International Law eigentlich ist. Aber dies war natürlich eine Täuschung, die lediglich aufgrund der klugen Argumentationsführung von Isabel V entstehen konnte. Ihre Rede vom vergangenen Dienstag machte jedenfalls nochmals deutlich, wie ihr Werk mit demjenigen von Siegfried Landshut verbunden ist. Nicht inhaltlich natürlich, aber im Hinblick auf die auch bei Landshut zu findende unendliche wissenschaftliche Neugierde, die sie antreibt, im Hinblick auf die disziplinierte Begriffsarbeit und im Hinblick auf die Bereitschaft, auch über die Grenzen ihres eigenen Faches hinauszugehen. Und ich bin sicher, ein ähnliches Unterfangen werden wir sogleich von ihr hören und sehen, wenn sie nämlich nun ihre zweite Vorlesung im Rahmen des Siegfried Landshut Lectures halten wird, die den Titel trägt War and Peace in 1913, International Law in the Balkan War Crisis. freuen Sie sich mit mir auf den Vortrag von Isabel Hall, den wir im Anschluss noch diskutieren werden. Auch dadurch, dass Sie über die Chat-Funktion im YouTube-Kanal Fragen stellen können. Isabel Hall, ich freue mich sehr auf Ihren Vortrag.
Thank you very much, Herr Knöbel, and especially for your very kind words. And once again, für diese große Auszeichnung, worauf ich mich sehr freue. Ich werde jetzt ein PowerPoint einschalten und hoffentlich geht das. What you'll hear today is part of a larger project, and it is work in progress on a difficult but I think important theme, which Herr Knöbel has already mentioned. So to begin, the outbreak of World War I is not usually analyzed in terms of international law. For example, how international law regulated the permissibility of resorting to armed force. In fact, the conventional view is there was no such law. The term for the international law regulating the use of force, jus ad bellum, was in fact not used until the 1920s. And one of the major writers today on the subject of the use of force in international law, the Israeli scholar Yoram Dinstein, summarizes the conventional view like this, quote, "Every state had a right to embark upon war whenever it pleased. The discretion of states in this matter was portrayed by writers on international law as unfettered." And that meant that the conventional view is that war, or a quote unquote right to go to war by states, was really only restricted at the earliest by 1919 with the League of Nations, perhaps in 1928 with the Paris Peace Pact, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, or certainly in 1946 with the United Nations Charter. Recently, scholars have revisited the doctrinal literature on the subject, and they've made some interesting discoveries. They've discovered that just war theory and natural law conceptions survived quite well into the 19th century. Just war held that there were three justifiable reasons to go to war: self-defense, the righting of a wrong, that is to fight for rights that some violator was of your rights or of an ally that some violator had pursued, and third, to punish violators of the law. And they have also discovered that, and the idea of an unlimited right to go to war as allegedly existing prior to 1914 is really an invention of the 1920s. And that places it, although most of the writers nowadays don't mention this, that places it within the Kriegsschulddebatte, the war guilt controversy. In other words, who started World War I, which is directly relevant to what actually we'll be discussing today. However, to date, there has been very little empirical work done on the actual way in which international law worked in diplomacy and in decision-making. My working hypothesis is that in Europe, the rules governing the right to use force were set down by the great powers who considered themselves the legislators of Europe in 1814, 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, with the aim to keep the peace. Not just the byproduct to keep it, but the aim to keep it. But they recognized three exceptions to this. The first was self-defense, which was then honed or made more precise in its definition in the course of the 19th century. Second, intervention, usually by a great or several great powers into smaller states which were undergoing or causing problems that threatened the peace of Europe or might in the future do so. And third, wars of national self-determination, which were in fact the main causes of war in the 19th century, which is by and large a very peaceful place in Europe. There were 7 such wars, 4 in Italian unification and 3 for German unification. So these 3 exceptions, self-defense, intervention, and wars of national self-determination, were the only 3 exceptions that were understood to be permissible. All other armed conflict would count as aggressive war, aggression. Tonight, what I will do is to extract from the Balkan Crisis in 1913 2 examples that illustrate the rules of self-defense and of intervention before 1914. So the background to this, here's a map of 1912, just before the Balkan Wars started. 4 Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece, got together and in an alliance, and in October of 1912 declared war on the Ottoman Empire in wars that were understood in Europe as wars of national self-determination and were therefore greeted as such, nowhere more enthusiastically than in Russia, which championed its Orthodox brethren. But Austria-Hungary was in the diplomatic phrase, the most interested party, because Serb expansion and victory would potentially make it a kind of magnet for Serbs and Croats living inside the monarchy. And so here are some examples. This is a really nice map of the different peoples understood linguistically of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you'll see that Austria and Hungary shared a border with Serbia and Montenegro.
Isabel, how?
Yeah?
We don't see the PowerPoint.
Ach.
Try it again.
Let's see. All right. Do you see it now?
No.
Then we're going to need some technical assistance because I'm doing exactly what I did before. If worst comes to worst, we can do without it, but it would be a pity. What I can do is call it up again and see if that works.
Try it again.
But I've done that. Let's see here. Oh, you know what? Wait a second. You still don't see it?
Nope.
Okay, wait a minute. One more thing. Go back here. Share screen. How about that? That'll do it.
Yeah, it's coming.
So?
Yeah, just go to the slideshow and then...
Yep, no, I've done that.
Yeah.
Now you see it. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Sorry. So here's the map of 1912, and with the bottom of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the 4 Balkan states and the Ottoman Empire. And you notice how very far to the north the Ottoman Empire actually reached. Here is a really nice map of the linguistic makeup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this kind of teal green at the bottom are the Croats and Serbs. And here is the problem. That green at the bottom, you'll see that there are more Croats and Serbs living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire than in Serbia. And the fear in Vienna was that if Serbia became very large, victorious, and was already quite nationalist, that it would act, as the phrase said, as a kind of Piedmont, as the magnet, and would in fact end up threatening the territorial integrity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The result of that was, let's see if the, and here we'll just go back to the map. The result of this was that Austrian leaders, not just the military ones, but also the civilian leaders, in the fall of 1912 made what I think of as a conditional decision for war, which actually in the historiography is largely unrecognized. So it's a very difficult historiographical issue. And the condition was that if Serbia became too large and too successful, that Austria would have to go in with forceful means to prevent that from happening. You should not imagine that the Austrians were warmongers. That might be true of Konrad von Hötzendorf, the general staff chief, but it's certainly not true of the foreign minister, Count Berchtold, or of Franz Josef, the emperor, or of others in the regime. But they all agreed on this fundamental problem that Serbia had to be kept small. It had to be kept off the Adriatic coast, which would make it too independent, and especially in economic and in a naval perspective. It should also be said that Serbia and Montenegro both lived up to Vienna's worst expectations of them during the war. And so the point of this is that Austria's subjective position was one of self-defense. That was what it was utterly convinced of. So what we're going to do is look at two episodes from a very, very rich year of crises. One of them is the Schootari Crisis of the spring of 1913, and the other one is a colloquy between the Austrian and the Italian foreign ministries, and Italy was Austria's ally, in which they discuss explicitly the issue of what constitutes self-defense. So first, the Schootari Crisis, which can be understood as a species of intervention. And a word about intervention first. Intervention was a controversial method that great powers used at the beginning of the 19th century in Europe to intervene in places that were thought to produce a problem that could grow greater and threaten the peace of Europe. It was controversial because the great powers couldn't decide whether what they should be doing would be like the Holy Alliance thought, to put down revolution and to restore reactionary governments, or the opposite, which is what Great Britain and later France thought, that you should keep the reactionaries out if they'd already been pushed down, and intervene on behalf of legitimate revolutionary or progressive governments. By 1849, those problems had been largely solved, and intervention was used mostly outside of Europe. In fact, Johann von Bernstorff has counted over 100 cases of interventions in the Ottoman Empire, and especially in Latin America. And it has been, I think, largely overlooked that intervention is a European phenomenon, which then was used elsewhere. Intervention was probably the most controversial subject that writers of international legal doctrine wrote about in the 19th century, because state practice seemed so various to them. Doctrine has produced two problems, which I just want to mention briefly. The first was that to outside observers, state practice seemed arbitrary, and therefore it seemed like they weren't following any rules at all. The reason for this is that the various problems that the great powers sought to solve by intervention were very different from place to place. They varied with situation. Categorizing intervention according to the problems that they were trying to solve won't work. But categorizing them by the procedures that they used will work, and that's what we'll be looking at in the Schootari Crisis are the procedures, and those were pretty uniform in the 19th century. Second, intervention was conventionally classified in the 19th century as, quote, measures short of war, which, with its suggestion that, in fact, intervention was not part of the jus ad bellum, or the laws governing when it was permitted to go to war, are part of the regime that was designed to restrict the use of force. And it is in fact part of that regime. The line between intervention and war, as actually we'll see in several examples here today, was very fluid. The invention of intervention was an effort, in fact, to restrict war. Okay, so let's begin. The Viennese decisions for war had to play out largely, although not entirely, because of decisions made in Berlin in the fall of 1912, because Austria needed Berlin's military help in case Russia would intervene against Austria. And so what happened was that in a series of conversations, the German leaders, the Kaiser, the Chancellor, the Foreign Minister, the Chief of the General Staff, and others, came up with what the Chancellor referred to as die richtige Basis, the right basis, the legal basis for launching a war of self-defense that would be acceptable to the German people, that would fulfill Germany and Austria's alliance, and that would be acceptable to Europe. And helpfully, the Kaiser set this down in writing. He was afraid that Austria's schroffen diktatorischen Ton with Serbia would produce an Existenzkampf mit drei Großmächten. Alles, weil Österreich die Serben nicht in Albanien oder Durazzo haben will. Durazzo is on the coast, on the Adriatic coast. Es ist klar, dass dieses Ziel für Deutschland keine Parole für einen Vernichtungskrieg bieten kann, said the Kaiser. And then he even more helpfully went out and underlined what would, which this is basically an outline of how you should begin a war that would be accepted as legitimate in 1913. Der Casus Foederis, this refers to the Austro-German alliance, which had existed since 1879. Der Casus Foederis tritt allerdings ein, wenn Österreich von Russland angegriffen wird. Aber nur dann, wenn Österreich Russland nicht zum Angriff provoziert hat, which is a quotation from the treaty. Das muss Wien unbedingt vermeiden. And then now comes his outline of how you start a legitimate war. Es soll Vermittlungsvorschläge anhören und machen und es den Russen überlassen, diese zu stürzen und die Serben aufzuhetzen, aufs Ganze zu gehen. Durch die eventuelle russische Ablehnung von den übrigen Mächten gebilligter, annehmbarer österreichischer Vermittlungsvorschläge setzen die Russen sich Wien gegenüber ins Unrecht, werden die Missbilligung der Mächte auf sich laden. And that would make Russia be the Störenfried or the Provozierende and would make the war acceptable. So that really lays out the diplomatic process that would make such a war acceptable to Europe. In short, that would meet Europe's expectations, the expectation of expectations. And here you have it in writing. Germany's attention to the law here is being done because of for military considerations, or at least it's being presented that way. But this is nonetheless a very nice précis of what a legitimate war looked like in Berlin in 1913. So now let's go on and look at those procedures. And it's convenient to understand them in sort of how to start a legitimate war in 1913 in three different phases. And phase one is avoiding a war altogether, how you do this. And you do it in a number of different ways. You do it by making diplomatic suggestions to the Balkan allies and to Austria and to the Ottoman Empire, and that was done, and all of them blithely disregard those suggestions. You can offer great power mediation or arbitration, and that was done at several different points, and very interestingly, in 1913. You can put together a conference, which is exactly, of course, what Edward Grey did in December of 1912, and that was the big diplomatic coup of the period was that that's what stopped Austria from going to war. And instead, the ambassadors' conference in London was called, where, like a kind of security council, where the great powers could talk together without interference and very quickly, on the one hand. And on the other hand, there was a parallel conference at the court of St. James, where the Balkan allies and the Ottoman Empire met and discussed. And finally, you could use international mechanisms to try to defuse the crisis. And another map, the existence of Albania. You could create a state, which, as you can see from the map, blocks Serbia from reaching the Adriatic. This is exactly the same procedure that was used in 1830 to create Belgium, and for exactly the same reasons. That the Netherlands government was incompetent, judging from the revolution, and nobody wanted France to go into the areas that became Belgium. So you create a Belgian neutral state. Albania was a neutral state, designed for the same reasons. In addition to that, you can use international commissions to draw the boundaries, to settle actually the governmental affairs until you can set up a government, and to do economic things like run the railroad that will help Serbia trade to go out to Durazzo, say, something like this, to do the economic interests. Okay, that just lets you see things a little bit clearer. Phase 2 happens when all of this doesn't seem to work very well, when fighting continues, which it did. And these are then the proper steps to legitimate a war. And they're really very interesting. The basic thing is that you must exhaust all measures preceding taking a warlike step. The San Giuliano, the foreign minister of Italy, said that you must exhaust all coercive measures compatible with the state of peace, which is that phrase of measures short of war. The foreign minister of the new foreign minister of Germany, Gottlieb von Jagow, put it a little differently. He said, you have to do all of this stuff bis Mächtekonzert nicht gänzlich verliert or sich definitiv impotent erweist hätte. Okay, which is to say that all of the mechanisms of international arbitration, diplomacy, and the rest have to collapse. And then, as the last resort, you may go to war. You still can't do that, and here's the second step, without preceding international agreement. And in fact, what happened is that fighting continued in this area. Russia and Austria deadlocked on the borders, and seeing that an Austro-Serb or Austro-Montenegrin war was becoming more and more likely, Sir Edward Grey rushed and did a compromise between Austria and Russia. This is the Schootari-Jakova Compromise of the 21st of March, 1913, whereby Schootari, which Montenegro wanted, would go to Albania, but two very small, and it was hard for me to find a map actually to find these places on it. These are tiny little Albanian towns, Jakova, which you'll see up in the purple part, and Dibra in the little part that goes in there. Those were both Albanian, basically Albanian-speaking towns, and they were going to go to Serbia. So Austria would have Albania get Schootari, and Russia, Serbia would get Jakova and Dibra to go to Serbia. Here is actually a nice map of, and you can guess who wanted what. The Russians, the Serbs, and the French wanted the darker brown. The Albanians wanted the lighter, bigger part, and the orange part is what ultimately was put together. The most important part of this compromise, however, was not any of this. It was the fact that the great powers had made a decision, had drawn on the map what they wanted, and this was now understood in the way that it had been since 1814, 1815 as a legal decision by the great powers. There it was. And that meant that if the Montenegrins or the Serbs did not accept this, you could use force legitimately to make this come about. And that was the Austrian quid pro quo for all of this. Okay, so the second step then, as I said, is getting international agreement. The third is that it helps you in making a case to go to war if you're responding to some terrible misbehavior. And Montenegro was not shy about offering misbehavior. It rejected great power advice. It shelled civilians. It invested Schootari, which on this map is called Škoder, and it and Serbia and Bulgaria engaged in ethnic cleansing and civilian massacres and on and on. And so Austria could claim, actually not incorrectly, that it was for humanitarian reasons to go into these areas. And that will ring a familiar note for us in our time, and with all the problems that that raises for the right to protect, for example, and the misuse of that for other reasons. Fourth, you had to notify the great powers in advance and explain one's measures. And in fact, Austria does this and produces another step in the process, and that is a joint naval blockade, let's see here, of Antivari here in Montenegro, which you see better in this on this map. So the joint naval blockade is yet another kind of thing you can do called the Pacific blockade. You can also get a European mandate, and here is San Giuliano urging Austria to do this, wodurch unsere eventuell gemeinsame Aktion, which means war, basically use of force, eine legale Basis erhielte. A European mandate meant that you were acting legally for Europe in doing whatever it was you did. And it meant, as Edward Gray put it, that the other powers assumed responsibility, that's a quotation, for what was happening on the ground, which is a very perilous thing to do if you don't quite trust the great powers that might be undertaking this, which is why it was very hard to put a mandate together in this period, regardless of whether it was Austria-Hungary in this area or later on in the summer, Russia in the Ottoman Empire. The mandate was also limited, and this is the reason that the chief of the general staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf in Austria, advised against accepting it. And he said, dass sich die Monarchie zu einer bloßen Exekution, that's another word for an intervention or mandate, nicht verleiten lassen dürfe. Die Aktion ist nur in Form des Krieges denkbar. Die Kosten und Opfer eines solchen aber verlangen dann auch einen dauernd greifbaren Gewinn, der nur in der Einverleibung Montenegros bestehen könnte. So the mandate is a very limited thing. And if you couldn't get a mandate, and in fact, throughout 1913, despite various efforts, nobody could get one, you could finally have the number 6, you could have several great powers act together. And why would that be preferable to one? Obviously, because it would prevent the most interested power in extending its sphere of influence, or even in doing the kind of conquest that Conrad von Hötzendorf and actually several people in high-ranking places in Austria-Hungary wanted to do. None of this worked, and in fact, Schootari fell 2 days after Gray had finally, with great difficulty, managed to put together the Jakova-Schootari compromise. And that seemed to fulfill Iago's condition that the Concert of Europe had failed. And that then launched the formalities that were required before going to war. And there are 2 or 3 of these, depending on how you count them. One of them is a formal announcement to the great powers that, in this case, Austria was going to do this. What does that do? It first of all permits them to have a response. It gives them a little bit more time to try to pull a rabbit out of a hat and stop what's going on. It permits you to announce once again why you are doing this. And here is Berchtolds' announcement. Die Durchsetzung der europäischen Beschlüsse zur Anwendung zu bringen. In other words, a specific acknowledgement that Austria is not acting for itself, but for in this case, law, international law. He also added another reason, that he was acting to uphold the prestige and würde of the great powers, which Montenegro had disdained. And he demanded effective joint measures without Austria for one last time. And that again shows bona fides. And finally, Montenegro itself had to be warned. And this was done several times. And the final step of warning a country that things are about to happen would come in the form of an ultimatum, which would lay down a timetable and make specific what steps needed to be taken to prevent what was about to happen, followed by a declaration of war. In 1907, at the Second Hague Peace Conference, Convention 3 made a declaration of war mandatory. You could no longer in Europe simply do a war without making a declaration. The purpose, again, of this was to gain time for negotiations and to force an explanation which it was hoped would limit bad intentions, shall we say. And astonishingly enough, this last thing worked. And the king of Montenegro, who is the world's most stubborn human being, finally intimated that he was willing to give in and give up Schootari. And in the moment in which that intimation was made, and before it was formal, all 5 great power ambassadors in London, including the German ambassador and the Italian ambassador, both allies of Austria-Hungary, instantly told Austria, you can't move. It's done now. It would be illegitimate for you to go forward. The fact is that it had gone forward so far, it had gone forward enough that the Austro-Hungarian government in the Common Council of Ministers had voted to go to war. It had gone so far that phase 3 is also clear to us in this case, and that is what is legitimate force under this situation. And here the basic rule is, as Edward Gray said, that the means must not be of any excessive character, so no excessive character. And just to make sure everybody understood this, he called the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Italian ambassadors into his chambers and gave them a little homily. He told them, if a weak man trespassed upon the ground of someone else, a much stronger man might be regarded as justified in turning him by force off the ground, but not in giving him a severe thrashing in his own house and even burning his house down. Berchtolds' response to this was quite different. And he said, ob dies nun ausdrücklich ausgesprochen wäre oder nicht, unser Vorgehen gegen Montenegro den Charakter des Krieges an sich tragen wird, in welchem die militärischen Notwendigkeiten in erster Linie maßgebend sein müssen. So he cites military necessity, which is to say, practically limitless ability to use force. And everybody rejects that, and including Germany. It is laid down that Austria must not have a war with Serbia, even if it is likely to encounter Serb troops fighting with Montenegrins around Schootari. There was to be no conquest of Montenegro. There was to be no occupation of the Montenegrin capital. The only thing that Austria was going to be permitted to do was to liberate Schootari and turn it over to an international force. So the diplomatic record makes quite clear that everybody understood these rules. There was no surprise here at all. It was clear to everybody. Okay, turning now to self-defense. What happened after this was that while Montenegro might have pulled out, in the Second Balkan War, Serbia doubled in size, and the Austrian nightmare now actually came to pass. And that caused Berchtold at the beginning of July to explain to Germany where things stood. And he said that a Serbian victory would be eine beträchtliche moralische und materielle Stärkung dieses uns traditionell feindlich gesinnten Nachbars sein, with its Anwachsen der großserbischen Ideenpropaganda, which would create for the monarchy einer für die Monarchie direkt abträglichen Situation. Wir wären erzwungen, einzugreifen, eine übermäßige Stärkung Serbiens zu verhindern. Diese Einmischung, and it's interesting, first of all, he presents Austria as being forced to intervene. He calls it diese Einmischung, which means he's still using the vocabulary of intervention. Diese Einmischung der Monarchie, welche nur eine selbstverständliche Abwehr wäre, it's only he's now claiming self-defense, könnte wiederum Russland veranlassen, aktiv zu werden with the danger of a major continental war. And he's basically telling Germany this because he wants Germany then to back Austria. So he's making, you can see right here the elision between intervention and major war. There's no real difference between the two. And you can see once again that Austria is claiming self-defense. The Austrian ambassador to Italy, also an ally, tells them the same thing and characterizes Austria's coming war with Serbia as eine Defensivaktion, to which San Giuliano, the Italian foreign minister, made this reply. And it's in German because it's a quotation by Meret, the Austrian ambassador back to Vienna. In unserem Falle, das heißt in Österreichs Falle, handelt es sich aber nicht eine imminente Gefahr und vor allem nicht eine ernstliche Bedrohung des Bestandes der Monarchie. And the penciled marginalium on Meret's report is Berchtold. Okay, so he's rejecting this argument. Dass Serbien uns bekriegen wolle, sei doch eine ganz indiskutable Annahme. Es handele sich also vermeintliche Zukunftsgefahren, denen man wohl mit anderen Mitteln vorbeugen könne als mit einem Kriege. Unser Angriff auf Serbien wäre also eine Offensivaktion im vollsten Sinne des Wortes. And here this exclamation point, this is about as worked up as Berchtold ever got. So this is actually means a lot. Und wir würden vor Europa und der Geschichte die volle Verantwortung für alle Folgen tragen. This is almost verbatim what have come to be known as the Caroline principles. This is the Caroline in flames going over Niagara Falls in 1839, or wie man sagt, die Niagara-Fälle. This incident occurred when this ship had been carrying insurrectionaries and weapons from the United States into Canada on behalf of revolutionaries in Canada. And at some point, Britain lost its temper, came over into American waters, grabbed this ship at the cost of one American life, set it aflames and sent it over the falls. And it took 3 years to settle this problem. But in the end, the Secretary of State, the American Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, and Great Britain came to an agreement. They agreed to disagree about the facts, but they agreed about the law. And that was set down in a letter from Webster, which said that a precipitate warlike action was only lawful if it was undertaken in the necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. The means could not be unreasonable or excessive, since the act was being justified as self-defense, and it must be limited by that necessity and kept clearly within it. It must be shown that admonition or remonstrance, otherwise known as diplomacy, was impracticable or would have been unavailing. This was the customary international law that both the United States and Britain agreed on. And if you compare it to what San Giuliano said in 1913, you'll see that it's really close. An imminente Gefahr, as instant, ernstliche Bedrohung, overwhelming, right? Und man wohl mit anderen Mitteln nicht vorbeugen könne, admonition or remonstrance is impracticable. But he's left out one thing, and that is nothing unreasonable or excessive. And I interpret that to mean that San Giuliano has perfectly well seen that what we're talking about here is a major European war. In short, what he has done is to take to indicate that the Caroline principles were, at least by one great power, which happened to be an ally of Austria-Hungary's, were taken to delineate the outermost point of what was acceptable as an argument for self-defense, in this case, preemption. In saying to Austria that bloße Zukunftsgefahren were not permissible, what San Giuliano is saying is that the preventive war, which Europe had deprecated already in 1875 in the war and site crisis, was still off limits. Okay, so what can we conclude from all of this? It's really a very simple conclusion, and that is that doing a legitimate war in 1913 in Europe by European states was actually very hard to do by 1913. It was hedged about with the many restrictions and the many procedures and hurdles, which I won't repeat. All of these rules and procedures were very well understood by all parties. They were the expectations of everybody. The self-proclaimed vital interests of states of great powers were by no means taken to legitimate recourse to force. If actions taken under that rubric ran afoul of these elaborate diplomatic and legal procedures or did not fulfill the expectations of customary law, that put the state im Unrecht. And that in turn opened it up to sanctions, which might even possibly include war, if they deviated from what Edward Gray called the usual course of behavior. And that usual course, it seems to me, had slipped almost seamlessly from diplomatic practice into customary law by 1913. Thank you. I'll get rid of this now.
Ja, liebe Frau Hall, vielen, vielen Dank für den großartigen Vortrag, der sehr detailreich war und ich glaube, eine ganze Reihe von Fragen aufwirft. Da ich momentan noch keine YouTube-Fragen sehe, will ich vielleicht gleich mal mit einer Verständnisfrage eines Soziologen beginnen, der von Geschichte keine Ahnung hat. Und die Frage lautet folgendermaßen. Sie haben ja ganz zu Beginn, wenn ich es richtig verstanden habe, ja dargestellt, dass die Friedensprinzipien im Prinzip 1814, 1815 im Kontext des Wiener Kongresses mehr oder minder schon festgezurrt waren. dass dort sozusagen auch darüber diskutiert wurde, wie eigentlich eine Friedensordnung auszusehen habe und dass es eben 3 Ausnahmen gegeben habe, die quasi begründen, warum man sozusagen in den Krieg geht. Self-Defense, das war sozusagen ihr erster Punkt, kann ich problemlos nachvollziehen. Self-Determination und dann letztendlich auch
Intervention.
Intervention, genau. Probleme habe ich im Verstehen von Self-Determination. Und zwar sozusagen natürlich aus der Schau des Stärkeren. Warum haben die Großmächte, die ja alle imperiale Mächte waren, die wie Österreich-Ungarn beispielsweise natürlich selbst Minderheiten auf ihrem Gebiet hatten, warum haben die es eigentlich akzeptiert, so ein aus unserer Sicht heute natürlich riskantes Prinzip festzuschreiben, was natürlich jede andere Großmacht möglicherweise in die Lage versetzt hätte, der Selbstbestimmung von Völkern nachzuhelfen? Warum sozusagen zog man noch keine Lehre des beginnenden Nationalismus?
Okay, two things. That's a great question. 2 things. What I've done is sort of densify the developments of the 19th century into a single sentence in order to save time. So the national self-determination exception is obviously much, much clearer after mid-century. When you've had the revolutions of 1848, certain problems have dropped out, and you're in a much more quote unquote liberal kind of atmosphere. So that would be absolutely right. But there is something to be reminded of, I think, and that is that we have tended always to think of the Congress of Vienna as this great reactionary restoration in which everything that had to do with the French Revolution was somehow thrown out the window. And that's not true. There were a lot of things and Metternich was as realistic as the next guy, who understood that things had gone far enough that you really couldn't do that. You couldn't get back to the world as it was in 1788. And part of that thing that had changed was, in fact, this principle of national self-determination. And you can see it in 1814 or 1815, actually, in the arguments about what is going to happen to Saxony. That Saxony was on the wrong side in the Battle of Leipzig. And as punishment for that, Prussia would have been happy to eat it up. And Castlereagh, for example, responds to that possibility as saying that it's utterly impossible because Saxony, there are Saxons and there should be a Saxony, which is actually a recognition of national self-determination. Although, again, from the later standpoint, they're all Germans. but from 1814, 1815, the argument that Castlereagh makes is that Saxons are Saxons and they deserve a Saxony and not a Prussia, and not to be a province of Prussia. So it's there in Nuce, and it really only flowers in after 1850. That would be, I guess, my response.
I can't see any questions up till now. Maybe I raise another question. When I read your book, which was published, I think, 2015, a scrap of paper, you were talking about persistent objectors. And Germany, in your point of view, was always a persistent objector from the very beginning, let's say, from the 1870s. I don't know why I speak in English, I switch to German again.
Es ist ansteckend.
So, wenn ich jetzt Ihren Ausführungen folge, die bis 1913 gehe, dann gab es ja doch relativ großen Konsens, was sozusagen die Friedensbedingungen betreffen. Also wenn Sie auch die deutschen Diplomaten zitieren, ist der Konsens ja eigentlich mit Abstrichen vermutlich da. Also wie muss man dann sozusagen die Thesen Ihres Buches von 2015 zu denen sehen, die Sie uns jetzt gerade präsentiert haben?
Noch eine gute Frage. Then there are several things to be said. I am rethinking everything, which I do when I get onto a new question, and new questions make you look at old problems in new ways, from a new angle. So that's one thing. Second thing, Germany in 1913, 1912, 1913, was pursuing a foreign policy that was based on the fear that war would be inevitable, or even with the conviction that war was inevitable in Europe, and that it would be best for Germany if Great Britain remained neutral or came in as late as possible. That would only be possible if Germany appeared to be in the right. And so it was very, very important for Germany that Austria-Hungary not dance off and look as though it had provoked a world war. And that also explains the very close sort of pas de deux that Germany and Great Britain do at this point. I did that first little quote from the Kaiser's memo of the 11th of November. I put that in there in order to show the motivation, or one of the motivations, for being interested in international law. So in addition to Great Britain, which was also a military consideration, there was the consideration of Germany's internal ability to fight a war from the standpoint of public support, especially the SPD, which really did care about international law for its own sake. So there's that. And finally, I would say this, that I understand 1914 to be the agreement on between Austria-Hungary and Germany that things have gotten bad enough, and they're not talking about the same things, but that things have gotten bad enough that although they know the rules, they're going to go ahead anyway, because they're not being served by the rules, or because the rules, and this is where they're very different. Austria feels, as you could see in this, that international law isn't helping it. The kinds of problems that Austria had were domestic political problems. Customary international law had nothing to say really about that. That was, if you couldn't solve your own problems and that made your neighbor dangerous to you, that's your business. So fix your internal problems. And in the end, that's what they decided to do, to fix them themselves. The German case is a case where I think that the leadership, and certainly the Großbürgertum and the Akademiker and so are in the grip of an understanding of Deutsche Sendung and of the fluidity of history and its rules. And therefore, they think that this old order is about to be swept away, and that they could sweep it away and produce a new order based upon basically Germany's hegemony in Europe, and that would produce something entirely new and different, and you'd go into another epoch of history. And that's certainly, you can find that idea there, but which does not mean that they don't know what the law is. It's that that as far as they're concerned, it's veraltet, or in the words of Bethmann Hollweg during the war, it's an anomaly. It doesn't fit, it's wrong, or it only serves the interests of the allies and not the Central Powers, which is, of course, then the argument that Carl Schmitt will make, and that is the usual argument in the Weimar Republic. But that does not mean that they don't know what everybody else's expectations are.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the answer you gave is quite close to the question raised now at the YouTube channel, raised by Alexander Rube, who's a member of our institute. And the question is, what do you imagine would be the implications of your findings for the debates on the July crisis of 1914 and the infamous Kriegsschuldfrage you cited yourself in the beginning?
Yeah, the July crisis is far from being a bunch of sleepwalkers who don't know what they're doing. These are people who have rehearsed these same things for an entire year, from October 1912 to October 1913. They all know where everybody stands. They all know what the arguments are. They all know what the interests are, and they've made their own position clear numerous times, in fact. It's funny, there's a political science argument about 1914 that imagines that 1914 is a case of misinformation or bad information. I actually think it's the very reverse. It's a case of the information that's so good that people, because of 1912, 1913, that decision makers kind of know everything. It's been choreographed. And when Austria and Germany reject negotiations, everybody knows what that means. It means that they have decided on war. And therefore, there you are. If a power decides on war, it's going to do it. And that does not, again, mean that there is no law. It means that somebody has decided, for some reasons, that it's more important to violate the law and go forward than to uphold it, or it is more in your interest, or whatever it may be. So that I have come, I think, to a much deeper understanding of what happened in 1914 by looking in such great detail in 1912, 1913, which is a very understudied crisis, probably because once the big war broke out, the Great War, everybody thought, well, why look at this? But this is really interesting because the wars didn't break out, and they were close to it, not just in May and October 1913, which most people grant, but in November and December 1912, in July, which is what we saw with the San Giuliano and Berchtold colloquy. Austria wanted to go to war in August and was stopped, and then as I say, in October, which most people grant. So it seems to me important from a methodological standpoint also to study those crises which don't end in war, to figure out why it is a crisis will end in war.
So you would probably say that, if I understood you correctly, that Christopher Clark's thesis of the sleepwalkers is basically wrong. And
I don't know who gave the book that title, and Chris Clark might not have done that. That could be an editor someplace. But I don't agree with that book, but I think there's one really important part of that book that really deserves underscoring, which I do agree with, and that is to re-understand the origins of the war as it happened in 1914 as being in the Balkans, and to look at Vienna and Serbia. That's really important. Germany did not do this by itself. In fact, Germany couldn't have done it by itself. Germany needed Austria just like Austria needed Germany. They both had to be in it together, and they both arrive they're fighting different wars, actually. And they both arrived there in different ways, and they crossed right at that moment when the high school kids bump off the Archduke. And, there's a wonderful article by Ned Lebeau, which imagines what would have happened if they missed. and in fact, the world would be I suspect, a very different place if that had not happened.
Okay, thank you so much. So there's another question going in a little bit of a different direction, raised by Mr. and Mrs. Keule. Craig foresees stresses that the Caroline test was established as customary law rather per chance. Are there other examples in the context of the early 20th century that the concert of Europe referred to it?
Yeah, this is a very good question. There are two books that just came out on this subject. And both of them argue, and I should have, in fact, I had it down and I just passed over it. I was getting nervous about the time, but both of them argue that the Caroline was not customary international law. The one of them argues that it is doctrine, that it exists only in doctrine until later when it becomes law or customary international law. And the other argues that it is that it's difficult to say anything really about it, but that legal arguers have had recourse to it after 1946, and they have made it into what it is today. And one can, recommend that one read those books to see those two arguments. Neither one of them mentions this case, and what I think is there is, if you go and look in the literature for the word Caroline, you won't find it, because they don't, even San Giuliano didn't refer to it in that way. What you're looking for is the difference between preemption and prevention. That's the nexus in which you want to be looking for this. What you're looking for is the contours of self-defense. And the place where you find this is in 1875, in the Warren-Site crisis, when Bismarck says Germany is going to act in self-defense against France, and he is stopped by especially Britain and Russia, and then forever after deprecates preventive war. So there's that. But it also comes up when all of these defensive alliances that are sort of known as the Bismarckian alliance system, they're all defensive. And that means that foreign ministers have a priority in understanding more exactly what self-defense really is, and in what circumstances you can call upon it and obligate your ally to come and fight with you. So those are the cases, that's where you need to look for it, not from the citation of the Caroline itself. I have begun looking for antecedents of it before 1839, and they're there. You can find, for example, Castlereagh has a rather famous state paper from 1820, where he says pretty much the same thing. And my bet is that if you rummage around in the diplomatic record, you will find that what Daniel Webster set down was probably described pretty well what people thought would cover you in a case like that, in a particular kind of self-defense. But beyond that, I can't say it, and nobody has done this. Nobody has actually gone through the diplomatic documents to look for Caroline-like precedents that I'm aware of. And if you know of it, you please email me, because I'm very interested to find that out.
Okay, thank you very much. Lars Döpking is coming back to a question I have already raised at the very beginning. He asks, isn't the right to fight a war for self-determination also connected to the issues raised by the Napoleonic Wars and the occupatio bellica, so the right of sovereign states to oppose their occupation?
Yes, that's, and I will recur to my response to you, that actually this, let me answer this in a slightly different way, which is perhaps more interesting and introduces another point. Not just simply that this is especially a product of the latter part of the 19th century, the post-1850 part, nor the part that in fact there's a lot more French Revolutionary stuff in the European settlement of 1814, 1815, but this, that public opinion plays a very large role in international law. And all of the states in 1913 spend a lot of time thinking about the reaction of their publics. In both the case of Russia and Britain, in fact, both of those governments make that the centerpiece of their arguments about what they are going to do in the case of a war. And they do it repeatedly. Everybody, all of the foreign offices are avid newspaper readers, and that's the venue in which they imagine they can read public opinion. Public opinion in 1913 was extremely pro-Balkan. Part of this is anti-Islamic, sort of Christian identity kind of stuff that you would expect. But a lot of it is, in fact, a reflection of this notion of national self-determination and a right of people to have their own government. And it's only when that really big massacres happen that starts to waver, and people begin to think, wow, maybe this is costing too much. Maybe this is really kind of ickier than we thought. But the growth of the importance of public opinion and the vociferousness of public opinion on this issue grow. They already exist in 1814, 1815. After all, the French Revolution, the French Revolutionary Wars go on for 23 years. That's a long time. It's a whole generation. And people are used to this. And there's a lot of stuff there that is part of the word zeitgeist, fuzzy expression, that only becomes more developed as the 19th century goes on. And that means that it makes it harder for states to argue against national self-determination. And in fact, Austria never argues against it in 1912, 1913. It comes out repeatedly in favor of it, which is quite notable and which caused the rest of Europe to sort of raise its eyebrows, because it was obvious to everybody that if you carried that principle to its logical conclusion, there wouldn't be an Austria-Hungary. And yet Austria itself does not dare to speak against national self-determination in 1912, 1913.
Okay. So there's another question raised by Stefan Maltana, which may be related to the question you just answered. In the case you described, the relevance of international customary law seemed to be based on the notion that one would draw the disapproval of the other powers onto oneself. Was there a strong autonomous idea of the community of European powers as some kind of a generalized other, which is a sociological concept coming from the US? Or did the different relations to these other powers as potential allies, enemies, etc., have a strong effect on how relevant their disapproval was considered to be from early on?
Yeah, that's a good question. The great powers do consider themselves and have considered themselves since the Napoleonic Wars as a community. And obviously Prussia then becomes Germany, and France is invited in. And then after Italy is unified, Italy is invited in as well. So there are 6 of them. And they continue to have a very strong sense of themselves as the legislators of Europe and as the main policemen of what happens there as a group. And Iago's phrase about the Mächtekonzert is a obeisance to this. But the fact that he sees the possibility of it not operating and then freeing a power or its allies to operate is also equally a measure of what you're talking about, that the alliance system and the breaking of Europe into sort of 2 parts or 2.5 parts, because of course Britain was not allied to either France or Russia, does undercut the Mächtekonzert because, and you can see it actually in 1912, 1913, the Entente, especially France and Russia and Germany and Austria, settle things together or try to before they talk to their fellows in their fellow ambassadors in London. It doesn't always happen. In fact, the great powers, the idea of the great powers acting together is extremely strong, but it is true that it is being undercut by the alliance system, but it is by no means so weakened that it doesn't function at all. It does function. The problem is that it is hard to do, and the diplomats in 1912, 1913 are utterly exhausted by the efforts to do this and to arrive at conclusions that everybody accepts. I don't see any difference in that particularly than what goes on in the Security Council, which is a dispiriting organization to look at if you'd like something to get done. You probably noticed actually that France quoted by in our latest crisis, which is ongoing in Israel and Gaza, that France quoted Biden in order to try to force the United States to back France's resolution about a ceasefire in between the Israelis and Hamas. That is a really interesting example of an ally trying to overcome that kind of a diplomatic problem. So that the argument that there's one more thing to be said. You can find the sentence, "the concert is dead," said in the mouths of a lot of foreign ministers in October 1913. That's true. And what they're referring to there is the impossibility of over the long haul of getting not just all the great powers on a page, but getting smaller powers to listen to them. It's two things. The Balkans don't listen anymore. The Ottomans don't listen anymore. And then the two alliance groups tend to talk to one another and only then talk as great powers together. So there are a lot of things that are changing and happening in the course of the latter part of the 19th century.
Okay, thank you. I would like to have a comment on one of the slides you showed us. What I really found surprising was the slide where you can find the quote by Edward Gray, when he used all the metaphorical language. You know, you might beat a man up, but you don't burn his house down or something like that. So was that a typical understanding of how to comment on customary law, or was that only a idiosyncratic expression of one diplomat?
It's very typical of Gray, who all of these guys speak differently. If you look at them, that's one of the fascinating things, is all of these people are really people and they have different ways of saying things. But the reason that I put that up, in addition to the fact that I think it's funny, and that he would call these three guys in and give them this little story, is I read that as a not atypically British effort to make a point without being impolite, blunt, without running the risk of making a misstep, of using a phrase that somebody could pick up and get angry at. and something like this. But it was that kind of thing you can find in the diplomatic correspondence pretty regularly. It's not unusual, but it is very usual for Gray to be somewhat oblique in the way that he expresses things in an effort. What you need to know about Gray is that it's really, he is the guy who is orchestrating all of this stuff in London. The ambassadors' conference is chaired by him. He runs it. He talks to all of the guys independently, and then in particular groups. He puts them together. He will bring two people together whom he knows disagree on something in order to work that out. He's very, very skillful, and it causes such a, it is such a difficult task to do by 1913 that he actually has to take a long vacation to recover from all of this. And you can't bring him to try to do it when in the Second Balkan War. He basically says, no, I'm sorry, folks. We did Albania and we're done here. And the Second Balkan War is actually ended in Bucharest. It's the Romanian government which does it. And no great power is involved in it. And this is a first. This is revolutionary in European diplomatic history of the 19th century. And to go back to the previous question, it is an example of the weakening of the great powers as legislators. No question about it.
Okay, ich habe vielleicht jetzt, wir sollten, glaube ich, allmählich zum Ende kommen. Wir überfordern Sie vielleicht dann auch schon mit unseren Fragen. Ich habe noch mal eine Frage, die sich vielleicht gar nicht so sehr auf Ihre Präsentation bezieht, sondern eher in die Zukunft, in Anführungszeichen, geht. Sie haben ja über ein lange bestehendes Gewohnheitsrecht seit 1814, 15 gesprochen. Sie haben quasi erzählt, wie dieses Recht offensichtlich ganz gut funktionierte, bis 1913 zumindest. Und die Frage stellt sich natürlich, wie entwickelt sich so ein Gewohnheitsrecht weiter, nachdem es zur Katastrophe kommt? Also der Weltkrieg bricht aus, es ist ein fürchterliches Schlachten. Alle Gewohnheiten gelten in diesen 4 Jahren offensichtlich überhaupt nichts mehr. Klar, danach gibt es wieder Friedenskonferenzen, es kommt zur Gründung des Völkerbundes und so weiter. Aber welche Auswirkungen haben diese Verheerungen des Krieges für das nicht geschriebene Gewohnheitsrecht? Zumal ja auch quasi relativ schnell Italien faschistisch wird. Die russische Revolution ist da, von Europa als einem Generalized Other zu sprechen, wird immer schwieriger. Also was bedeutet das für das Gewohnheitsrecht?
That's a very good question. And normally, the way people look at this, they're not really looking at customary international law. Because, for example, regarding the law against using, or the laws regulating using force, because of this conventional view that there was none, but they do look at international law altogether. And the conventional view has been that everybody thought that it had been an utter train wreck, and that you basically have to start over again, and that the League of Nations is the example of that. And then the League of Nations doesn't work, and you have another train wreck that's even worse, and then you set up the United Nations, and so that the kind of interpretation is you learn from your errors and then you move on, and number 2, that there's a big leap in each case. And as you can see from the way, or perhaps can see, when I look at things, I see much more of a continuity than breaks. If you think, for example, about the Covenant of the League of Nations and what it tries to do to prevent wars from happening, is it picks up these procedures and just puts them, makes you do them. You have to do arbitration or mediation. You have to wait at the end, and so on. It simply takes the procedures and codifies them. And no one has made the argument that those things are customary international law, but it seems to me you could make it. The notion in the Kellogg-Briand Pact that you're not to use force for sort of, to solve international problems is not unrelated to what I've been describing. The interesting thing is that intervention or specific forms of intervention, it has been shown, do weaken in the interwar years. They're not used anymore, and nobody thinks that they're proper anymore. So there's definitely change and everything. And I don't know, whether this is a glass half full, glass half empty kind of proposition, but the way I see things is that the attempt is to fortify international law by creating institutions that will somehow make it stronger. And that these don't work at first for a variety of reasons. They, in many ways, still don't work all that well for solving certain problems. But what I see is a continuity of procedures and visions and desires and diplomatic habits that continue. One of the problems, this is something where I blame Wilson. I think that without Woodrow Wilson and Robert Lansing, a number of things would have happened in 1919 that would have shown this continuity much more clearly. And they cut stuff short, which then was only picked up after in the Atlantic Charter and in 1945 with the charter of the International Military Tribunal and things like this. So that people do make a difference. And the United States was, I think, clearly on the wrong side in 1919 and held a lot of things back that were being pushed by France and Britain, which were much more in line with how the assumptions about what's proper and what isn't in the period before the war. And then you're faced with the problem of what you do about, especially Germany, that then could and did then argue that these rules were basically helped Britain and France, but were disadvantageous to Germany, and basically making the argument that international law is only the expression of those who have power or who are the victors, and not anything else. And that's, of course, a whole other story.
Ich glaube, das war jetzt ein sehr gutes Schlusswort. Liebe Frau Hall, ich bedanke mich unendlich dafür, dass Sie nicht nur eine Rede am Dienstag, sondern auch diesen Vortrag so wunderbar heute gehalten haben. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich für Ihre Diskussionsbereitschaft. Danke natürlich auch den Fragenden im YouTube-Kanal. Ich will ganz kurz noch mal sagen, wir haben vorher informell darüber gesprochen. Wir wollen natürlich Isabel Hall nach Hamburg holen, so schnell es geht. Sie will auch kommen. Wir freuen uns darüber. Wir freuen uns dann auch vielleicht noch mal einen anderen Vortrag, müssen wir natürlich ausdiskutieren, am Hamburger Institut zu hören und mit ihr von Angesicht zu Angesicht zu diskutieren in einer hoffentlich besseren Zeit, die vielleicht auch bald anbrechen wird. Also nochmals vielen Dank all den Helfern im Hintergrund, vielen Dank auch noch natürlich an Tide TV, die das möglich gemacht haben, und letztendlich sozusagen wünsche ich Ihnen allen einen wunderschönen Abend, ein Gruß, der natürlich auch in die USA zu Ihnen geht, Frau Hall. Vielen Dank nochmal an alle.
Ich bedanke mich auch.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.